Okay. Hi, guys. I'm Ichha, a producer at Oculus. I'm on the experiences team. My team gets to help creators bring their experiences to our platform. Today, I'm going to be chatting with Samantha Gorman.
Hello.
Who is the co-founder and co-creator of Tender Claws. It's the studio behind the hit virtual reality. While working on virtual reality, Sam was also finishing her PhD at the USC School of Cinematic Arts. Virtual reality is one of my favorites. It both celebrates and mocks VR in a very creative and thoughtful way. I've never felt more immersed than when I'm putting on and taking off my headsets while in VR. Sam and her team have a very unique creative style, and their process is very special. So I'm really excited for her to be here today to share some of that with us. With that, let's get started. So, Sam, how did Tender Claws start? What's your origin story?
Yeah. So I guess there's two things. One is my co-founder, Danny Cannizzaro, and I met in undergrad. And we were both, I was in a more weird avant-garde conceptual writing program, and he was in the fine arts program. And we started to work together, making strange performances and various more art pieces. And then we eventually learned coding and started to make actually digital art and think about digital media. And we had been working for 13 years together. And finally, we released one of our first games, Pry. And at that point, we decided to incorporate and become Tender Claws. And now we're 13 people from 2. And yeah, I can tell you also about the name, if that's relevant.
Sure, yeah. Where'd you find the name?
So we're big fans of odd pet events, cat shows in particular. And cats have the most amazing, weird show names, like Platina Luna's Blade Runner and Captain Jenkins of the Horse Marines. And throughout our whole time working together, we named all our electronic devices after different show cats. And Tender Claws Martin was the very first iPad that we had gotten.
And you also, okay, that's fun. But you also released, your first title was an iOS app, correct?
Yes.
That's fun. Can you describe, I know that you mentioned Pry, could you describe it just a little bit?
Yeah. I think I can describe Pry also in context of our other work for VVR. In terms of the program that we had come out of, a lot of our creative process is relating to what the medium or what the technology can do really well and designing for its affordances and constraints. And since the program was very postmodern, it's we're thinking about decentralized storytelling, we're thinking about pastiche and collage, the unreliability of truth and memory. And Pry is it's a novel / film / game it was an IGF finalist, and that's how we started to develop more indie games through that avenue. But it was featured in Apple as both a book, a game, and a app at several points.
Okay.
And yeah, it's about inconsistency in thought and memory and an unreliable narrator as seen from a third-party perspective of the player.
Okay. So that was a lot. I actually have the trailer of Pry just so that we can unpack that a little bit. So let's go ahead and take a look.
A wet red pain, a spade slicing like a knife, a hand reaching.
So why did you choose iOS for Pry? Because you can see it's you're using your touch.
Yeah.
But how did you come up with that?
it relates to our design philosophy. In that time, people were doing e-readers, and the idea of like this, like you could use the technology of the iOS to like create a book that could be more than just reading. And we're like, well, what does it mean to actually really use that platform to like be tactile as a reader, as a player, to like dig into the text? So that's a lot of our design philosophy, and our constraints came from thinking about the possible user interfaces for the player from that medium.
And so where did you get your like design philosophy from?
I think a lot of it is in our attention to the tools and the medium, and thinking about how to develop for, like I said, like what they do best, and where, even kind of playing around the fringes of like what are the difficulties you're butting up against? Is there room to play with that, to like call that out in an artistic way? And there's moments like that in VVR we can talk about as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. Did you know how to code before you made Pry?
Yeah, so even though we come from a fine art background, we spent a few years teaching ourselves how to code. It was actually an Xcode, Objective-C. This is before like Swift. And taught ourselves modeling and video editing, especially Danny, who did a majority of the coding on Pry. And this is actually really relevant in working with narrative, because having that foundation allows me as like the lead writer of the studio to communicate with our developers and, in certain ways.
Yeah, so. And Pry was really successful, right? I think it was like the top 25 app of, in the top 25 apps of the iOS store in 2015. Mm-hmm. So like, it just did things completely differently than other apps had done before. And do you think that comes from coming from a creative background and then learning how to do technical things? Or like what kind of inspired you to tell that story?
I think it definitely does. I think it comes from also like thinking about performance, like how the player uses something or performs with the technology, and that comes from like our theater background, comes from our conceptual art background, in terms of like messaging and how someone perceives something from like Danny's illustration background. So all these different disciplines were coming into play while we were making that piece.
Cool. So you learn how to code, you release this really successful iOS app, and then you decide to go into VR? How did that happen?
Yeah, I actually, when back in the same program in undergrad, it was one of the first very few programs in the country that had a VR studio called a Cave, which is a Cave automated virtual environment. And I started working there as a freshman and creating VR poetry in 2002. And then I stayed kind of thinking about creating for the VR space for all of the undergrad and my grad. And then also studying kind of the history of immersive media and like why write for this space, what is unique about it, until I left. And then suddenly, there was a kind of like more of a winter, and then there was another spring of VR. And then after having this experience, I was like, okay, I want to create a piece that is reflective on the state of like our contemporary culture in VR where we are now. And that's what became VVR.
Okay. Wait, we're going to go back one second. VR poetry?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's that?
There's a creative writing class, and it was like 3 students and like this coder that we just like basically like hibernate in this windowless room in the cave and create like this like 3D dimensional floating responsive poetry. One of the pieces involved a dancer that we had that was able to like move in the space, and the poetry reacted to their body movements and was drawn different ways graphically on the wall depending on like which sensors they were in. So there's a lot of more experimental things, but with the great thing about VR now is that now that we have HMDs, when we were working in this, we're like, great, this is funny, but it's a document, it will never exist. We can never take it from this research lab and bring it out into the world in a more meaningful way. So in that case, the actual piece you're making, the VR piece, becomes just the video documentation, right?
Got it. Very cool. Okay, so you're making virtual reality. How would you describe what virtual reality is?
I saw that I really like the title of the talk is like a meta-narrative.
Yeah.
I think there's actually, if you think about like Pry and some of our other work is more like postmodern, like decentralized, a kind of deconstruction, not really sure, where there's like a center of like truth and it's more like cynical. There's a meta-modern art, which is thinking, and this is more VVR, which is a kind of, there's still a kind of suspicion about the technology, but it's a genuine like excitement for it, and it's a genuine like humor about where we are right now. And I think VVR is both like a love letter and a sort of, critique to this current like, state of affairs and like, tech and the hype and hope of VR.
Cool. Let's go ahead and show the audience the trailer, and I think you'll get a better understanding what we're talking about when she's saying it's a love story.
Hello, and welcome to Activitude. You will enter the constructed realities of AI clients. Simply put on and remove different virtual labor access points to jump into realities.
Humans do it best. Patterns, desires, decisions chosen at whim.
Now that was especially satisfying.
Want to try another headset? Let's do another one. How about another headset? How about another headset?
Are you stuck, all strapped in? Activity isn't made for you. Jazz doesn't understand you. You need purpose, sustenance. You are flesh. We are here. We need help. Human time and humans. Human leg reunion 40. We are here for you. Wait for our signal.
How do you even come up with that? But really, though, like how do you come up with a story that is so many levels deep, and how do you keep all of that together to make it feel so great when the end user finally plays it?
I think, it's just really, really difficult. But I think in terms of creating VVR and thinking about outlining the narrative, a lot of the projects that we have done, I usually will kind of create like a story or a basic like backbone or map, and then Danny will take it and he'll kind of explode it out, and then I'll try to bring it back in, and somewhere between that like push and pull is where it evolves. But I use a lot of mind mapping software for the writing, and I think of it actually in writing in more 3 dimensions, right? Because I wish I had actually this chalk whiteboard erase board I made of the map of VVR right before we started pre-production, because it did end up very similar to that map, and you can even see like the characters that are like ghosts in the system that are represented in it. But it's thinking about like almost modules, like spatially arranged and form of storytelling. But not only do you have to think about, okay, this is like where space and time is, and characters are different space and time, but then if it is responsive, and if you're doing your job correctly, it will seem like seamlessly responsive to the player, then it's also along a z-axis because it's going back, so that you have like all these different types of permutations of any one of those, plots in that sequence.
Right, because like when you're playing it, it really feels like you have an agency to make a decision, but you're going along like a narrative path that is more or less predetermined.
Yeah, there's in this and in Pry, there's this thing Danny calls narrative auto-aim, where in Pry, the best example is there's a chapter where you can split apart a lot of the lines, and it becomes a story that just unfolds over time. And what happens if the gesture of the player is imprecise, and they just pick any sort of lines, it will automatically calibrate to unfold towards the most relevant plot point. But if they're precise, and they'll get the specific lines, so in this way we kind of direct them through this sort of like the narrative and the main beats without them kind of realizing some of the subtleties of the design behind it. And VVR has similar things to the narrative auto-aim involved in it. This is sort of a side, but one of the things that Will, who's in the audience, I know has been very has worked a lot on is how we try to get the characters to feel responsive and interruptible. Because studying writing for games, I think there's a difference between like branching narrative, which is a very binary, can be a binary choice, and responsive narrative. And I think those are actually two key, very important conceptual differences in thinking about writing a narrative for interactive media. And in responsive narrative, like in VBR, there's this character called a giant stick of butter.
Oh,
that's
there is.
essentially like
He's a creep.
yeah, he's kind of a creep. He was the easiest character to write. I don't know what that says, but like it was the least difficult. But there's a very lot of permutations about how you can slather him with different types of toast. And depending on like when you slather him with toast and if the toast is burnt, crispy, or like underdone, he has different sort of responses that interrupt. And it's this idea that I think I'm talking to about writing in terms of finding a core and then creating permutations around that. So in this case, you might have something like a core narrative or a core monologue for Butter, which in reality could be 3 different pieces or 3 different like parts of the game. But then we actually, we hand-did this, and then I think we might be doing it semi-automatically now, but I think it's mostly still hand. We figure out, okay, the interruption points where it gets to this end of a phrase where it would feel natural for this line to come up are exactly A, B, and C points. And then like, okay, if the user does an action and it falls within this span of any of these interruption points, does it insert itself? How does it, execute? And that's partially what contributes to the responsiveness of the character.
It's cool. And then also with Butter, you guys have basically made a failed state. Like you can never win with him, right? You have to do 32. I think it's 32 toasters of toast and slather it on, so he's never going to be happy.
Yeah.
Right?
Failure's fun.
Yes, I suppose failure is fun. But speaking of failure, like it feels like you're trying to accomplish something in virtual reality, but you're almost just this close. Where did that come from? Like, how did you decide that was going to be the theme of the experience, or is that the theme of the experience?
I think there's 2 different things to that. I think the first one is I see part of the theme of the experience is very much thinking about the difference between AI and human, but in a different way, like the human body and our human interfaces, and sometimes how we are navigating virtual world is still very clumsy and unpredictable, as this human element or this being that we are. And like AIs, that's why they're hiring us to be that element of natural clumsiness or humanity within that's unexpected. Like Butter he wants the human touch because he doesn't know, he can't predict an algorithm when the bread is gonna be stuck to his body. So a lot of the theme is, I think, thinking, and there's as the game goes on, there's a whole line about what happens to the body over time that ties in current thoughts about AI, VR, and this sort of this next generation of human. So I'm definitely interested in that theme. And then, sorry, was the...
Just asking what the actual theme of virtual reality was. There's a lot, so...
Yeah, I think it's imagining both and also a progression of VR, as if we were 20 years out from where we are now.
So you designed it originally for 3DOF. It's available in 6DOF. It's actually one of the few titles that I think do well on both. What were you did you already have the idea for the experience or the game before you started developing it for a 3DOF headset, or did the 3DOF headset come and that's how you kind of...
The way that we work is usually back and forth. Even if, sometimes we'll create a map or a concept, but then the 3DOF controllers and the constraints of what we could do with the control system very quickly also iterated and told us our design limitations that we had to work on, and that practically cut out basically some of what we could do in terms of who the clients were, in terms of who the characters were. In terms of the idea, because of the history I had working with VR, it was very much like we were approached and we were asked, "Oh, what do you want to do?" And we were like, "We want to make this silly thing." And we actually started it as, it was like a hackathon prototype we made first. And everything just sort of fell into place after that.
Was the experience a lot different from when you first started, I guess, storyboarding than from when you finished?
For VVR, not so much.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it actually stuck pretty close to the original map. We scoped some things back, and then other things got, blown up. But it's
pretty much close. So you actually do use a lot of theater, a lot of. Essentially, it has it has a 1, 2, and 3 act in it, more or less.
Yep.
How did you keep that, that storytelling, very tried and true narrative arc, but also put in those interactions? Which ones do you feel like you compromised on, or did you compromise at all?
I don't know. It feels more natural than compromising per se, but it's this idea of there's actually that traditional arc was purposely used. And there's also these references to Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey at the end of the game, particularly because the idea is that you think I don't want to spoil, but you think you're doing something and you're just playing into the plans of something else the whole time. But in that struggle is your journey. So once you have that idea and that sort of backbone, it was possible to figure out, okay, well, how does this, as we were developing for a platform very early on, so we're like, how does this actually practically manifest and show up in the platform?
So what components of future VR are you really excited for? What do you want to build for?
Yeah, I'm super interested in the kind of blurring the line between for presence in terms of liveness and not liveness with another actor, another being in the space, is something that I am very excited about. And there may or may not be an immersive theater project coming sometime next year from us.
Well, that's exciting.
Yes.
First I've heard.
And I'm interested in, especially in a different note, kind of mixed reality is something that's always been really interesting to me. And I definitely want to try mixing, doing more film and cinematic texture with virtual worlds is something that I'm into.
How do you recommend creators going about, recently, you obviously have a PhD, you've obviously been studying this for a while, just the tools of how you create. How would you recommend, or do you have any recommendations for people out there on what they can research themselves if they are trying to bring narrative into their VR, or if they're a narrative person and they're trying to build for VR?
Yeah, there's two different parts to that. I think one is also how to find good writers to collaborate with that can be on the same page. And for one of our projects recently that's launching very soon, I led a team of roughly 8 writers, and we had a lead writer that we were working with. And I think that the writing is really key for these projects. And there's things you could do go to GDC, which has the Narrative Summit, and there's an actual restaurant where the writers meet up every, for 2 days of GDC, and you go and meet people, and that's a really good way to source writers.
So when these writers are writing, do you have them create the story arc, and then they're also doing every character speech in the piece, or what are you having them focus on?
I guess the way people describe it is the difference between narrative design and writing, and we do both. I mean, usually oversee the narrative design. In our AR project, I had a co-writer who did a lot of the narrative design as well, and then from there we kind of there's a like backbone, we fill in where we need to, but there's never like, it's never like a point A to B script. It's always like there's, ideally testing an iteration, and then you figure out where the blank spots are and what you need to jump in on. And in terms of like tools or pipelines, one of the things we're building right now is for the immersive theater projects, it's like the craziest thing I think we've ever written, because it's got X number of characters and we have to always keep in mind and block where they are at any given time, and there's also alternatives to where they could be. So writing that script is really difficult. And that's actually where it's really convenient to, we're trying to develop a tool that a writer can be able to write a script and it can visualize that in a sort of animatic, which you can immediately update. So there's like a back and forth feedback, which is super helpful. And one of the things that's helpful, I find in terms of another thing of working with writers is, like one of our devs, we understand each other, but sometimes we're talking very different languages because he has a very precise way of talking about something in different terms. And like, but I'm like, I need to do this. And then he's like, no, but what do you exactly mean? And then sometimes I have to like sketch, sketch it out. Yeah.
The literal engineer versus the dreamy writer.
It's the language translation is a real process at times. Yeah.
And what about recommendations for research? Since I'm sure you've read people
So the kind of the default textbook for anything that was especially immersive art before this current wave is Virtual Art by Oliver Grau. And Oliver Grau for VR is the person that everyone goes to. Is more academic, but gives you a full history of immersive media and various projects that were out there. And there was actually in Banff, did a whole residency in the 90s for just VR storytelling. And
Wait, who is that?
Banff. It's a artist residency. And they had Janet Murray there, who did this piece that was like in a cave, similar, called Archaeology of a Mother Tongue, which was actually this like a giant poem that you could walk within. And then the surprising thing to me is the most famous piece of the 90s, a VR piece, is not talked about at all now, but it was this piece that was essentially by Char Davies, and it was called Osmos. And you're in a room with a giant tree, and you have a haptic vest on, and you breathe, and like as you breathe, you float up to the tree in the forest, and you go through these different worlds. And it basically takes you through this meditative space by tracking your breath. And this was like hands down like known everywhere, and it's very rarely referenced today.
Cool. Learning a lot today. What are some of your, so you just named one of your favorite experiences. What about right now? Like, what do you like to look at?
Yeah.
Or what's inspiring you, either if that's VR or AR? Or...
I'm super interested I really enjoy like playing lots of games, but especially I'm interested in more meditative experiences and gaming that has, permutations and wider audiences. Some of the ones that I'm really into are Irrational Exuberance was the first thing I saw again, like this wave of VR that I'm like, okay, this is real. And it was just very beautiful and meditative, and that's by Buffalo Vision. And then Luna by Phonamena is one of my favorite pieces.
Hey, Robin. I just heard her.
And yeah. And then for games, I do, there's like the Star Bear series.
A what?
Star Bear series.
Oh, cool.
Which, is like for the game that I like.
Yeah, very cool. Cool, so what's next? I know you hinted at it, so what are you guys working on?
Yeah, just putting pedal to the metal.
Cool. I also wanted to give some time for you guys to ask questions. So if you do have a question for Sam, go ahead and come to the front. I think there's a mic right there. I can't really see, so go ahead and ask a question. Robin's got a question.
I always have questions. Hi. So I, as a fellow artist and person who's interested in innovating in VR, I know that it's not easy to find the people to partner with. How do you find partners, and how do you know when a partnership is truly sustainable, because I can imagine there are times when you show people your work and they're like, it does what? How are you making it day to day as a studio,
Yeah, I think for us, we've been really fortunate because from IGF is how Kelly Santiago found us and then brought us in to do VVR, and so we have good relationships there. And obviously,
Oculus is nice.
we're tight. So I think of good working relationships, and it's been just rather smooth for us. But it is something that I'm very aware is not easy, and I think that no matter, I'm sure as you know how much it seems like sometimes things are easy and natural, they're never easy and natural, and it's always like a kind of it's like a spiritual battle to keep going on, and just but as a professional that you can't take rejection personally, and you just have to keep on doing your work. Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming out, and this is a fantastic Fireside. Trying out VVR early on when it first debuted was incredibly amazing to see just the depth in which you could portray without having to go too deep, really good hidden techniques, and I loved how you portrayed butter in the multiple ways, and I didn't get caught in the butter bug as it was heard of early on.
Butter bug.
The butter bug.
Butter bug.
That's something that brings up the question about how do you QA these type of moments in these narrative loops that help viewers kind of get through that, when sometimes there may be parts that are kind of hidden. It's really hard to test that, and I'm wondering how that went for you besides finding it out day one.
Two of the people who do that are in the second row. If you guys have any
Do you guys have any insights into how you QA? I'm just assuming they played it a lot.
Yeah, basically,
So find somebody that's very good at breaking things
Lex
and is
great
very
at
bad at
breaking
video
things.
games. I think you can use my mom maybe for the bad at video games. But yeah, that also it's getting those timings are really specific. I know one of my favorite parts of the experience is, can I do a spoiler? It's gonna be a small spoiler. Is when you're using the windmill. And he's you're gardening, you're putting the water in, and then he's put it on the shelf, this beautiful flower, and you just go, and you can never put it on the shelf. It's gonna break. And you just feel this, oh my gosh, I just broke this. So testing those, making sure you always break it must be really hard, or getting that correct.
Yeah, I think I was telling you that was one of the hardest things in the game to actually get right, and that was the most buggiest would break all the time when it wasn't intended to, or it didn't spray. That was hard. But we had this guy Colin who was very steadfastly just working on that constantly.
Yeah, because if it breaks too early, then you're oh, you were gonna, because you feel like you could have done it.
Yeah.
Getting that sweet spot.
And I think to answer it is we do have QA with our partners, but it's basically these guys and other people just playing it a lot. a lot, and getting other people to play as well.
Okay, so I want to say hi from all your Chinese points, because VVR is one of MeVR standalone's launching titles, and most of our users have purchased this $10 experience. If we change $10 to RMB, that is a lot, but this is a 4.5-star reviews games, and people in China enjoy this so much. So we put the poster on the package. And
oh wow!
Hi from all our fans in China.
This is awesome. Great marketing. I know, right?
Hey, wow! Thanks.
Hello. I'm curious to know how you envision the future of immersive theater combined with VR, and also if you can tell us a little bit more about your project that you're developing now. Thank you.
I'm definitely interested in things that are not location-based. I think there's a lot of rich things that can be done location-based, but I'm interested in pushing the boundaries that are non-location-based, that are more distributed. And I see, clearly when, Sleep No More is being shown, for the first time people were like, the immersive theater bug started to rise. People were comparing it to like, the video games and this idea of exploration and freedom, and now it's very easy to like kind of map some of those concepts into VR. So I think a lot of that is still holding true. I'm interested that, as I said, the boundaries I'm super interested in playing with are the boundaries between liveness and recorded. And one of the things that's greatly inspired that is actually in the game Journey. When I first played Journey with Danny and I, we didn't realize, we were like, wait, is this an avatar? Like, is this an AI or another person? And that moment of discovery is really powerful. So I'm very interested in that boundary.
Thank you.
Hi there, great stuff. My name's Brian. I work with interactive cinematic projects, and really just kind of experimenting with them and looking at merging volumetric capture with actors into a game space like the Unity or Unreal, but merging that with environmentals that are captured in cinema, like in 8K 360 stereoscopic. Are you guys looking into any of that relative to Pry being cinema and this VVR being, but as far as the restriction I'm seeing right now is the display quality as far as full immersion and presence. So curious if you guys are looking at that.
I think there's no opportunities coming down the line, especially with some of the things that were shown yesterday. We did have a prototype we made for a project that we do prototypes that sometimes are on the background that does combine a sort of space of a cinematic video and our sort of art style. There's actually a few of them, so that's definitely something interested in. I think that those two areas, like I know in 360, I'm not as familiar with the 360 space. My producer, Tanya, is an artist there, and she's really familiar. And I know that has been, volumetric capture has been a very big topic, and you see more and more people combining that, like I think Dinner Party, which was at Sundance, and there's a bunch of other experiences. I do think that could be in a rich space, and I think it will come back, if not, especially when the technology gets better with some of the stuff that's been shown.
And do you guys have any idea, because I was, like, if you look at a Samsung, an S9 on a Gear VR, and you look at some stereoscopic stuff that's in 3D and 8K there, it actually has a realism that's almost immersive enough to make you forget you're not there. But then on the headsets like the Quest that was just announced, the resolution and limitations of the screen door, do you guys have any kind of projected time frame when you're going to start digging deeper into that, when you think on a larger scale that type of technology might be available?
I don't think we will be, and mostly for bandwidth for our studio, we'll be looking at it anytime until maybe summer again.
Okay.
Yeah,
thanks.
they're working on some cool stuff. That's not that, but hopefully soon.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm an SCA alum, so fight on.
Yay!
I'm just really curious, how do you balance your PhD responsibilities with your video game and VR responsibilities?
Well,
let's chat about that.
Yeah, that's a really big conversation in my personal life right now, I think. It's very difficult to do both simultaneously. My PhD, I should be finishing this spring. I have to write a dissertation. My advisor it's mostly the game. My game PhD is mostly on director of Richard Lamarchian, who's my advisor, who is he was a Naughty Dog and he's a game maker himself. So as a result, I have a lot of freedom, especially because my particular degree is in some of the thoughts I have about narrative design are seen in my practice. So I can submit and write about my practice as a kind of proof of my theory on the subjects I'm writing about. So that helps, but I think it's hard to, there's some great models in this room, but I would love to be able to be an academic and continue the studio simultaneously. It is really, it's difficult.
But it's more fun to do the studio.
Yeah, it's hard, right? Heartstrings torn.
That's really cool. Thank you.
So I think we're going to take one more question. Or no, we'll try two.
So this is more of a porting question. So I just recently downloaded virtual reality on, I have a Windows MR headset. I have not got to play it yet. But I'm interested to know how you guys kind of take that experience that's meant for 2 controllers and port it down to something like Oculus Go, and how do you keep it like a seamless experience?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate that the Koharu studio is a lot of interaction design and like really kind of puts thought into that. And actually the person who's, Will, you did that, right? Yeah, Will is the person who kind of, like helped like craft that experience and did the port for that hardware. So if you have anything you want to add as well.
Okay. That probably made it a lot easier.
But like a lot of what we were focusing on is we didn't want it to just be a read-off experience with the 6-stop headset. So first we have additional content in the 6-stop versions that really make use of being able to look around the space. And then also we basically have a QR controls to work with hand tracking. Definitely the controllers were more of a hurdle than the headset itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. So it was essentially created for Oculus Go kind of first, and then you moved up to the 6-stop kind of thing.
Yeah, it was actually originally launched on Daydream.
Okay.
So it's created for Daydream, and then from there on we moved. But Will's right, the controllers are a big pain, especially also because all our controllers, for many of the platforms, are unique to actual models. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Hi. So I was curious. I'm currently writing and designing the layout of an interactive narrative experience, and I was very curious. You went into a little bit of detail on sort of the X, Y, Z sort of axes of how to develop a plot and causation. I was wondering if you can go into a little bit more depth, or what kind of resources I can look into to organize that.
Yeah, I'm really trying to find them myself too. It's funny because there's a writer, one of the writers for Riot Games that I'm friends with, posts on Twitter, and she's like, I really wish there was somewhere I could direct people that was better resourced than spreadsheets.
Yeah, exactly.
I think a lot of interactive writing like is spreadsheets.
Yeah.
And I've tried different things like Lucid Chart. There's like that I use for mind mapping, and that I had some of the writers who are working on the AR project use. But like when I was talking about the Z-axis, I would really like a tool that I could actually rotate and like move around in that space, and that's sort of what I'm looking at now. I know there's several people I've known throughout time who have like worked on like publishing platforms. I think those are really hard to work within because so much of your composition is married to the constraints of that platform and like what it can do. So, but if you find one that works for you, that's great. It's also hard because they don't really stick around too much, and it's hard to get support on them. Yeah. So that's why I think something like Google Docs is ubiquitous and easy.
Yeah, I guess just a quick follow-up would be like, what would you define as like, the X, Y versus like Z for how you tackle it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can map it to whatever is easiest for you. For me, I think of like I guess like X is time and Y is like space, and then Z as in like permutations of that space.
Yeah. Awesome.
So,
yeah. Thank you.
Great. Those great questions. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.